Hey, so what's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Today we're going to take a look at the Civil War. Now, what you have to first understand, first and foremost, about the Civil War is that it is a different type of war because it was the first time within the history of our country that we were not actually fighting another country. We were actually fighting ourselves. During the Civil War, as some of you may know, and as you will find out, it was the North versus the South. It was the Union versus the Confederate. And so, what we're going to do today is take a look at the Civil War and how it not only impacted then, but how it also continues to impact us today in 2020. So the country was completely and deeply divided. The main issue that centered around the division was slavery. Slavery was a true economic um, commodity for the South, meaning that was how they made their money. You did not have individuals that went out and worked their own land. You had slave owners, you had plantation owners that used slave labor to build their massive empires, whether it was cotton or sugarcane or tobacco or rice. There were just so many different cash crops in the South that they were looking to cash in on, but they knew that they did not have the ability to do it on their own. And so what they utilized was slave labor. Now, I'm sure by now you are familiar with the triangular trade, where there were goods flowing from Europe into Africa, and then there were slaves coming from Africa to the Americas, both North and South America, and then from North and South America, you had those cash crops that I just talked about, that rice and sugar and tobacco and cotton. So it was something that was long time had been in place, and it was something that a lot of people were making a lot of money off of. And so what you have happened is first South Carolina seceded. The word secede simply means to leave. So South Carolina left the Union. Now, the Union, what you have to understand is that the Union at that time comprised of all of the United States. And so when South Carolina seceded, they essentially left the United States. Although we know geographically it's still part of the United States, what they essentially did was they broke away from the Union and created their own separate entity. As that began to happen, more and more states ended up doing that. And before you knew it, there were 11 states that had joined the Confederacy. So all 11 of those states had seceded or left the Union and were now part of what they became known to be the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis was named the president of the Confederacy, and he would serve as the leader of the Confederacy and would continue to lead them throughout the Civil War. Now, here's a map where you can see the difference between um, the election of 1860. And you see here you had the red states are for Abraham Lincoln, and the blue states were in favor of J.C. Breckinridge. Now, the election of 1860, President Lincoln did win that election, and he would go on to serve as the president of the United States. At that time, the Union. However, things would change again as the Confederate States of America broke apart or seceded from the Union and formed essentially their own country. So Fort Sumter is the location of the first battle of the Civil War. Located on the coast of South Carolina along the Atlantic Ocean, Fort Sumter was a Union fort, meaning that was one of the country's forts. It was attacked by Confederate troops who were taking it for themselves. After 34 hours, so just a little short of a day and a half of fighting, the Union troops surrendered, and this is what began the Civil War on April 12th, 1861. So, in all total, there were 23 states in the North, and then you had 11 states in the South. So they would then break apart, and basically, you can think of it from the aspect of having a team. So you had the North or the Union as one team, and then you had the Confederates or the South as another team. And so the North was led by Abraham Lincoln, and the South was led by Jefferson Davis. So again, here you have the breakdown of what the Confederate States and the Union States, what they looked like, and then you also see the Union territory. Now, mind you, The Union territory was something that was not yet, many of those places had not yet gained statehood. And so they're just simply territories of the Union. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that the Union was the original United States. Okay, you have to, I'm going to keep impressing that upon you that the Confederate States broke away from the Union. So you had the Union as a whole, but then the Confederates decided they didn't like the way that things were going, so they broke away from the Union and and formed the Confederate States of America. So you see the dividing line here. And yes, living here in Missouri, we were considered a Union state from the Missouri Compromise. However, one of the things that we will talk about in a little more detail later on in this unit is the fact that Missouri was very much so on the border. Quite often, it is considered a border state, meaning that there were places in Missouri, roughly south of the Mason Dixon line, that were actually in favor or pro slavery. However, up north of the Mason Dixon line, you had people who were anti slavery. So there were issues here within the state of Missouri that also led to a lot of fighting here in the state of Missouri, where you had families fighting against families. You had cousins that were fighting each other. They were blood related cousins fighting each other because they were on different sides of the issue of slavery, which was the main and central focus of the Civil War. So the Union struggled early. They were completely outnumbered. The South was fighting in their own backyard. And so you have to understand Fort Sumter is located in South Carolina. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. So you had Union troops that were located there in South Carolina. However, the issue was that the majority of the other troops from the Union were located in the North. So those few Union troops that were located in the South were completely outnumbered because they were not in their own neighborhood, if you think of it that way. They were fighting in someone else's neighborhood. And so they didn't have the protection of having all of the other troops there, to fight, help fight those wars and those battles initially. And so the Union was on the verge of losing the war and needed a battle that they had to win, and that came in the form of Antietam. On September 17th, 1862, Antietam, the Battle of Antietam, became known as the bloodiest day in United States history. This battle occurred in Maryland, and what happened was it was a swift victory for the Union. This was a victory that they needed desperately because they knew that as the Confederate troops began to march north, they were trying to take more territory. You have to think of it this way: the person who can eat up the most territory on a map typically is going to be the one who wins. They're typically going to be the ones who are the decision makers and the policy makers. And so the North, or the Union, had to stop the advancement of the Confederacy, because if they failed to do so, then that meant that they would be susceptible to allowing the Confederates to completely take over the Union. And who knows what that would have looked like in the United States had that actually happened. So the Union Army stopped the Confederate Army. This victory gave President Lincoln the chance to announce the abolition of slavery in the South. And so that came on January 1st, 1863. So the new year rolls over, and now here it is. President Abraham Lincoln declares and decrees the Emancipation Proclamation. Simply put, the word emancipate means to stop something, and then the proclamation simply means to announce something or to declare something. So it simply declared, the Emancipation Proclamation declared, that all slaves should be set free in the Confederacy. Now, President Lincoln still had the authority to say that and to do that because in his eyes, there was still only the Union. In his eyes, the Northerners did not recognize the power or the assumed authority of the Confederacy. And so for President Lincoln, he still saw himself as the president of the United States. So when this proclamation went out into the land, it was declared legal because technically the Confederacy had basically seceded without permission. They left the country without permission, but that doesn't mean that the power and the authority is no longer with the president to speak over what happens in the entire United States. Now, of course, the South did ignore the Emancipation Proclamation, but it did really, really shift the focus now to the issue of slavery for the Civil War. So Gettysburg. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battles, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. I had the opportunity and the privilege to visit Gettysburg. My wife is from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, not far from Gettysburg, and literally the battlefield is, you would think when you say battlefield that there's only one, but essentially the entire town was a battlefield. Massive, large open fields, but you also have the town of Gettysburg, where there were some buildings. There are still some buildings that were built during that time period that still exist. But the one thing that you notice when you step foot into Gettysburg is that there's just a whole lot of open land. So this isn't war from the aspect of how we think about war today, where you have to go find your enemy. Literally, they were out in these open fields and they fired at one another. They knew who they were fighting. They could see who they were fighting. They could see who they were attacking. This is where you have your cavalry, where you have your horseback riders that fought on horseback. And so it's one of those things to where we still have those around today in our military. Being a military child myself, you have the first Armored Division, you have the cavalry, 5th Cavalry Infantry, I believe it is. And so these individuals are basically descendants from the time period of the Civil War. So in all total, 97,000 Union soldiers fought, 75,000 Confederate soldiers near the small Pennsylvania town. So right there, you have over close to 200,000 people fighting in that one location in a span of 3 days. And so there was a lot of fighting that went on in that one location, and it was a crushing defeat for the Confederates. Gettysburg really became a turning point for the Union, and that really gave them the momentum to continue to do what they did with the rest of the Civil War. So here, these are actual photos from Gettysburg. As you can see, as I talked about, wide open fields, and they're just fighting. There in the distance, you can see someone on horseback, probably a part of the cavalry. So the Gettysburg Address, 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, again, I did have the privilege of seeing where President Lincoln actually stood and delivered the Gettysburg Address. And basically, what he talked about was he just simply wanted to honor those that had died. And he also dedicated the Gettysburg Cemetery, which is still there, and you can visit it. And it's a wonderful sight to see because it transports you back to that time in history. So the end of the war. And again, this is just a brief overview. We will look at a few of these things in a little more detail. But in March of 1864, President Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant to lead the army and to face off against Robert E. Lee, who was the leading general, the commanding general of the Confederate troops. On November 6th of 1864, President Lincoln was reelected. So you had President Lincoln be elected the first time in 1860. Now he's reelected in 1864. And so that keeps him in place. And what you have to understand is that when a country reelects a president, that means they have faith and confidence in what they're doing. They're going to continue, their plan. General Grant then enlisted the service of General Sherman, William T. Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, to march through the South from Atlanta to the Atlantic coast in 1864 to destroy the South's ability to fight. Now, here's one interesting fact about that. The city of Savannah, Georgia, located in southeastern Georgia along the Atlantic Ocean, was the only major city that was not burnt to the ground by General Sherman. So General Sherman was indeed successful in his ventures to cripple the South's ability and willingness to fight, and it led to the surrender of the Confederate troops on April 9th of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Confederate General Robert E. Lee met with Union General Ulysses S. Grant, where he then surrendered, thus ending the Civil War.